Hello again, everyone. One more thing which I didn't mention on this slide, which is perhaps worth mentioning before we move on. I talked about the decline in the post-war tower blocks. What I didn't also mention is that they also came to be seen as associated with a great deal of social problems also. Again, because of lack of maintenance and problems like that, they became quite undesirable. Lots of people who had the choice moved out, and so they became very much associated with things like crime and misdemeanors as well. In fact, they even attracted at one point the name slums in the sky. And so I suppose we have this further association just to demonstrate that things really come in cycles between urban living and poverty and crime, which in a sense is not that different to what we saw looking at the pictures in 1945 at the beginning of this period. To move on then to some of the other themes that we can discuss, the next one then that I would like to think about is with regards to religion as a factor in people's lives. Now, at the start of this period, well, I'll begin by prefacing, really since the Victorian period, the general trend has been towards a lessening or a lack of religious observance in in Britain. With some notable spikes, there were rises during and after the two world wars, for example. But what's interesting, really, though, is the fact that they can't halt the general decline. And I have a few numbers on here that demonstrate this overall trend towards what we can call secularization, which is to say, a country which is non-religious. I mean, of course, technically, the Church of England remains the state religion of England, but is increasingly remote from many people's lives. So in 1945, 80% of Britons identify as Christian, and that's interesting. That's not even attend church, for example, but would simply, in a census, would put that down as their religion. By 20%, by 2000, that has fallen to 64%, and again by 2018 to 53%. In other words, well over a third fall, and that's simply of people who would use that label of themselves. And the more telling number there is the 13% who actually attend church regularly. In other words, really, that kind of regular religious observance seems to be now rather a minority pastime. And look at that percentage, 40% that would now identify as being non-religious in some capacity. So in a sense, I suppose now to have no religion is almost as much of a creed as any particular faith. And that ranges from agnostics who are simply not too concerned about the idea, through principled atheists who rationally asserts that the idea of a god, for example, cannot exist, and that sort of thing. But it's a real sort of increase in skepticism, a real decline in faith. The only areas of Christianity which are identified to be rising are in what we class as the non-conformist churches, things like Baptists and other evangelical movements. In some cases, that's linked again to patterns of immigration. If people bring more living faiths with them, as it were. In other cases, perhaps not. There was a concept that was coined by the famous atheist Richard Dawkins. He described Britain as a country which had a cultural Christianity, the argument that actually it's Christian morals and habits of mind that underpin all our social habits. But the question you have to ask is whether that is then perhaps also falling. but one example that he gave, for example, he said that, well, our ideas about crime and murder, that the Ten Commandments say thou shalt not kill, and our law also says thou shalt not kill. Therefore, his argument was that that's evidence of cultural Christianity. Of course, a cynic might say that other religions similarly prohibit violence, but that was his thesis. The only other areas, and I suppose again to some extent is linked to people who bring faiths with them from overseas and so on. The only other area of religion which sees rise in observance is, for example, things like Islam, where vibrant and living religious communities arrive in the country and reinvigorate that aspect of public faith. But overall, the trend towards secularization. Moving then now through a few more sort of minor themes here. Now, another interesting one about relations between people, particularly in terms of couples. So there's a few things on here, and I've got some excellent advertising to illustrate it. In 1945, then, the first thing to state is that the nuclear family, the idea of the classic, sort of two parents, multiple children, is still very much seen as being the norm, the heteronormative idea for society. Although, having said that, it has come under threat due to things in wartime. For example, you have a lot of relationships where a husband, for example, might have been in the army for several years, might have been fighting overseas for several years. A lot of people, therefore, suffer things like relationship breakdowns as a result of it. And so there is a rise in discontentment after the war. Although, having said that, while there is a rise in discontent in existing marriages, there is also actually a boom in new marriages, as people look to, as it were, celebrate peacetime by settling down. But very much that was the case, and very much divorce a rarity. It was still something that was difficult and expensive and more common for the middle classes. Now, incredibly, it was illegal to have a divorce by the consent of both partners. You couldn't simply say, we don't want to be married anymore. And so what you used to have to do was to prove guilt on the part of one or the other member of the marriage. And so there was a whole industry where people would pay people, usually a prostitute, and a private detective, and they would stage having an affair. They would get a private detective to take some pictures of, for example, them sitting in a bed with the prostitute, that they would then use in court as evidence so that the marriage could be dissolved. And it was seen as a real humiliation that one or the other of the people might have to go through with that in order to prove that there had supposedly been a fault, or that the divorce could take place. You can see why that was obviously very difficult to do and very unpopular. But they would, for example, pay staff at the hotel. It was a perk that staff at hotels would accept at the time, that they would be paid to act as a witness in a trial, to say, yes, I saw the gentleman turn up with this woman, or whatever it might have been. So completely inefficient. And as you see, by 1969 down there is the Divorce Reform Act, which for the first time suggests that you can actually be divorced by common consent. There are others as well, but that's perhaps the main trend. But it gives people more freedom over their lives. Now, in terms of other aspects, there is a rise in contraception use due to fears of soldiers suffering from STIs during the Second World War. But again, comparatively expensive, comparatively difficult to obtain. And it's interesting just to have a little look at some of the contemporary advertising here, just for a little chortle about attitudes towards these things. The poster on the top there, the woman carrying the sign saying, I've got VD short for venereal disease, which is the old-fashioned name for an STI, and the headline, they don't wear labels. But consider how it's very much bizarrely seen to be a kind of something that's at the fault of these female temptresses. You see this poor pitiful man there in the VD war looking out in the corner saying, "Brother, you can say that again." There's another one in the bottom right corner. She may be a bag of trouble, and you have this picture of this woman who's shown wearing lipstick and smoking a cigarette, which presumably must be signs of very loose morals. But you have these really bizarre ideas that actually sexual activity is almost something to fear. And to an extent, that doesn't change that much until really you see 1961, the contraceptive pill, which first starts to emerge and which obviously then grows in popularity throughout the 1960s. And it's an iconic moment because it's seen to be something that hands control of contraception over to women. It's not simply relying on a man to wear a condom, for example, but that a woman can take a pill, can take control of her own body, and it's seen as being crucial. And you see the top right there, there's an advertising poster for the pill. It says, "That's right, boys, I'm on the pill." And you see this happy, carefree woman who presumably now can have a lovely time now that she doesn't have to worry about any of these consequences. Really rather bizarre, but again, it brings about this greater freedom in people's relationships, and therefore there is, anecdotally at least, there seems to be a rise in things like relationships outside of marriage and things like that. The general trend is towards greater autonomy for people throughout this time, greater control over their bodies. So in 1967 you have the Abortion Act. Prior to this time, it was illegal. People would have it done by, often by things like old ladies down back streets, these illegal abortionists operating without medical licenses, without training, in some cases using really horrible things. I mean, one of the stereotypical things is the idea of, knitting needles and things like that. Absolutely awful ideas. No one quite knows now, I suppose, how much it was true, but they say that there were huge numbers taking place illegally, a lot of women becoming ill and dying as a result of it. And so a real step forward that this actually became a healthy option. We've mentioned divorce reform, Equal Pay Act as well in 1975, meaning that it becomes illegal not to offer a woman the same salary as a man for an equivalent job. And in 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act, so that again, it's another step towards equality. And of course, as you all know, that hasn't fully, perhaps still always trickled down even today, but the point is it's a sign of good intentions. We have a suggestion then, therefore, that life for women perhaps is getting better in terms of people's relationships. There's a little bit more freedom in terms of how people go on to live their lives, and the old idea that of sort of things like no sex before marriage, and the idea of a formal courtship with an engagement and then a marriage becomes a bit more fluid. And we talk about changing attitudes to identities, and as often is the case, there are liberalisations and reactions. The top left image here comes from the 1950s and shows the kind of archetypal 1950s housewife. Incidentally, you see some of the modern labour-saving devices. I think it was linked back to Harold Macmillan and his "You Never Had It So Good." You've got the idea here of a modern oven. You've got a range of pans. You've got hot and cold water from the taps. You've got scales. All these kind of mod cons that were seen at the time, and indeed did help to free women from the burden of domestic labour. But it's still a vision of womanhood that is fundamentally centred around the home. You start to see that changing. There's an image of it from the right, with some 60s fashions, and you start to get this sense that women are going out to work in increasing numbers, having more disposable incomes, more freedom, and things like that. In contrast to that kind of glamorization, by the 70s, it's not always simply about that kind of style. There's a sort of hippie type thing there. But what's interesting is the picture of Margaret Thatcher in the bottom right-hand corner here in the 1980s. And isn't it remarkable to think that only 40 years ago, perhaps a little less, that the Prime Minister of the country could still be wanting to show herself in a domestic setting ironing one of her husband's shirts. And isn't it strange in that sense how similar the iconography is here, with the oven and so on, to the 1950s one on the other side? Again, it's a reaction, for all the talk about people going out and gaining freedoms, there will always be trends towards things that are a little bit more conservative. In this case, obviously politically and socially. Well, what about sexuality and sexual identity more often? Well, as everyone knows, at the beginning of this period, homosexuality was something which remained illegal. It remained illegal until 1967, when it was legalised in the UK. Prior to that, it was, of course, a criminal offence. Although, strangely enough, it's only just over a century before that, in the 1860s, that it ceased to be a capital offence. In other words, you could actually be hanged for homosexuality. So I suppose in that sense there had been some slight progress prior to that time. I should probably state, actually, male homosexuality. Interestingly enough, lesbianism, or homosexuality between females, has never actually been illegal in this country, curiously enough. Because, and as I understand it, the reason for that is that it was always defined in terms of penetration, and therefore the assumption was that that didn't really involve women. A kind of classic anecdote on the subject of this is from 1952. Alan Turing, who some of you may have heard of, who was an absolute mathematical genius. He'd been involved with code breaking at a place called Bletchley Park during the Second World War, and he was instrumental in breaking Nazi codes that helped to win the war. But in 1952 he was arrested and with another man, was charged and convicted of homosexual activity, and given the choice of imprisonment or hormone therapy, which caused him tremendous problems, including physical changes like the growing of breasts. I think it was to do with estrogen and the lowering of testosterone levels in order to make you to lower your sex drive. I think that was the idea. Caused him tremendous problems. He lost his job as a result of the stigma and committed suicide in 1954. And while this is obviously a good representative case of the kind of things that could happen, the evidence is actually that on the whole these kind of things were in decline, and as is often the case, the law was rather catching up with changes in public morals. I think it's probably fair to say that up to this time, homosexuality was something that was becoming increasingly accepted in certain aspects of society. I mentioned down at the bottom here, certain communities, particularly things like the theatre, for example, were notoriously tolerant towards people of other societies. And the other picture there is of Noel Coward, the famous actor, songwriter, director, and so on. And I don't think anybody really who had watched his public persona from the 1930s to the 1960s could ever really have been in any doubt about his sexual orientation. But as I say, elements of tolerance within certain sectors. In terms of how this maps forward towards today, I suppose the trend towards increasing acceptance is very much a sort of a continuum and a continuing process up to the present day. And I think by and large that it is something that we now do see being publicly accepted much more. I mean, it's only sort of perhaps not 20 years since I was at school, and I can only think of one person in my year at school who was openly gay, although I know of a number of others who have since felt able to come out since that time. But I don't think that that's quite the same thing. I certainly see much more confidence for people to sort of to come to terms with these things now, I think, than in the past. But particularly when you come to read "Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit," the challenge of a young lesbian woman finding her place in the world is, I think, something that will be, is a real issue which we will need to grapple with. What else then? Well, class then is another key issue. Now, again, earlier in this period, there is still very much the stereotype of the fixed class system that's really a hangover from the earlier period, and it was famously satirised in the sketch which you see here with John Cleese, Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett, of the upper class, the middle class and the working class. But actually there is one significant factor, and it's thanks really to the Attlee Labour government in the 1940s, that has a huge impact on this, and that is the grammar schools. And I'll cover more on that later, but it opened up career pathways for working class children that really it would never have been viable to them even 20, 30 years before. By the 1990s, Tony Blair was very much keen on promoting this idea, as you see on the right here, that as he said, the class war is over. He also said we're all middle class now. And obviously that was very much idealised. That was clearly never the case. But his argument was that growing prosperity, growing disposable incomes meant that more and more people in society had the things that in the past would have belonged to somebody more affluent. His argument essentially was, more people had, for example, televisions, more people were able to go away on holiday, more people were able to travel abroad, things that had traditionally been seen as middle-class pastimes. And that's the sort of thing that he was arguing. Clearly, of course, as I said, not really the whole truth. And our attitudes to class are a lot more complicated than that. Another key trend that associates with it is what's sometimes referred to as a decline in deference. Deference meaning sort of respect due to your superiors in society. You see, at the beginning of this time and through the 1950s, there was still very much this idea of what was sometimes known as the patrician classes, the old people of wealthy families, and who were ruling the country. And this reached really the end of the line during the government of Harold Macmillan in something known as the Profumo scandal. John Profumo, the gentleman on the left here, was the Minister of Defence, and he was involved in a tremendously embarrassing scandal where he was sleeping with the lady here, Christine Keeler, who was a model and perhaps may have flirted with other professions, shall we say. He was married, but he had an affair with her, which he then lied about in Parliament and was forced to resign. It was particularly significant because she at the same time was also conducting a liaison with a Russian spy, and so it was a huge scandal. It threatened at one point to bring down the government, but it was also seen at this time in the early 1960s to represent this trend, the idea that the old guard was on its way out and the future was going to be different. And in some ways, the 1960s and the 1990s surprisingly parallel in many respects. Now, something else that's worth thinking about in the same way, we talk about how deference to the old authority figures had declined, and I suppose in a sense you can link that back to things like the fall of Churchill in 1945, if you wish, is that what people admired was changing. Now, there was very much a growing shift in focus towards those who had achieved recognition through their own abilities. The pictures there, you have Marilyn Monroe, Richard Burton, famous film stars, but people from very working class backgrounds. Burton was from a small town in South Wales. Marilyn Monroe famously was working on a factory production line during World War II when she was spotted by a photographer. And So new people to admire, but what's interesting about these is that it's working class icons. It's people, in a sense, who represent the modern fairy tale, this idea that you too can be plucked out of your mundane life and suddenly find yourself with stardom. Um, and through the picture below that, the Beatles, again at the beginning of the 1960s, it's four working class boys from Merseyside, um, but who became the poster boys for a nation. Um, these are things that simply would not have been able to happen before this time. There had been, for example, working class entertainers in things like the music hall, the old sort of theatres, and things like that, but that's a very small and very localised kind of stardom compared to the national and even international recognition achieved by the Beatles, who, for example, famously conquered America. Um, and I suppose then this democratization in popular culture that we can talk about kind of reaches its end point in a way when, by, for example, the early 2000s, you actually have a situation where people who are from more fortunate backgrounds and have wealth are deliberately attempting to seem more working class. Became known as Mockney, and a poster boy for this would be Jamie Oliver here. And you see this sort of joke here, my special Mockney twist, the idea that actually he was by hamming up his Essex accent, it was actually very much a persona that he was playing. And finally, there you have an example of a trend of British films that were big around that time. In this case, starring the ex-footballer Vinnie Jones, who again, because he had been seen as a thug and a hitman during his footballing career, but suddenly became a kind of icon. And for a while, he starred in several of these gangster films, notably directed by Guy Ritchie, who himself came from an affluent background and a private education, but spent a great deal of time hanging around with people like that, trying to prove his credentials as a man of the people. And Blair liked that too, as we saw earlier, with his guitar and his appearing with his mug of tea and things like that, which he liked to do in press conferences and public appearances. The problem is, though, is that there's always a reaction, and we've said that increasingly people admired the working classes, but that goes full circle. If we look at the pictures here, the first image you have is Albert Finney from the film of Saturday Night and Sunday Morning in 1961. He was a factory worker, but you see here the way that he's shot with the hair, with the shirt. It's working class life, but it is idealised. It's shown with a nobility to it. By the 1980s, you have loads of money. This aspect of working class life is then seen to be kind of critical. People seem to be perhaps greedy, things like that. But by the 1990s, you have there the Gallaghers of Oasis fame, the band. And in a sense, it come full circle. Being seen as being ordinary and authentic and working class seems to be admired. But once again, across the bottom here, you have the character of Vicky Pollard, created by Matt Lucas for Little Britain, which is this really cruel and crude stereotype of essentially of a poor person. You see on the left here, these are allegedly her children, and one quote was she supposedly had 6 children by 7 different dads. Or on the right here, what's it say? Just because I have sex with someone doesn't mean I fancy him. So there is a certain kind of cruelty that creeps into attitudes towards that, and I think arguably this is a trend that has increased in recent years. We've rather gone back away from our admiring of the working classes and more towards attitudes that are critical. Now we'll pause that here, and again we'll resume in the next video.